Welcome to the Flag Bearer channel. This is Little Known Black History Facts. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. During the 19th and 20th centuries, Black women played an active role in the struggle for universal suffrage, the right to vote. However, Black women were betrayed, exploited by the women's suffrage movement. The women's suffrage movement, a pivotal campaign in American history, sought to secure voting rights for women. While it achieved significant milestones, its history is marred by the exclusion and exploitation of Black women. Black women were marginalized and exploited by the women's suffrage movement. The women's suffrage movement in the United States gained momentum in the mid-19th century with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, marking a critical starting point. The movement was predominantly led by white women, including figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Early in her career, Susan B. Anthony was an abolitionist and worked closely with Frederick Douglass and other Black activists. She supported the 15th Amendment, which granted Black men the right to vote, despite initially advocating for universal suffrage for both Black men and all women. Over time, Anthony and her colleague, Elizabeth Stanton, began to prioritize white women's suffrage. This shift was partly strategic, as they believed that focusing on the rights of white women would be more politically expedient and garner broader support. To gain support from Southern white women and politicians, Anthony and Stanton sometimes used racist rhetoric. For example, they argued that it was unfair for uneducated Black men to have the vote, while educated white women did not. This rhetoric alienated many Black suffragists and highlighted the racial divide within the movement. Anthony's organizations often excluded Black women or placed them in segregated sections. Black suffragists were frequently asked to form their own clubs or to participate separately. They participated in their own political meetings and organized their own political societies. African American women attended political conventions at their local churches where they planned strategies to gain the right to vote. While the movement aimed to secure voting rights for all women, racial tensions and strategic decisions led to the exclusion of Black women from mainstream suffrage activities. While Anthony and Stanton are in history books, their failure to check what many perceive as their racism worked against Black women who were also denied access to the ballot box. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had championed equality for Black Americans, even signing an 1864 congressional petition that pushed for the passage of the 13th Amendment. But the ratification of the 15th Amendment turned the tide because it secured voting rights for men of all races, but didn't extend that right to women. Anthony stated, quote, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ask for the ballot for the Negro and not for the woman," unquote. Anna Howard Shaw, president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, argued that you have put the ballot in the hands of your Black men, thus making them political superiors of white women. Never before in the history of the world have men made former slaves the political masters of their former mistresses. When the 15th Amendment passed, white suffragists began pushing harder for voting rights for white women, to the exclusion of African American, Native American, and Asian women. Many famous white people working for women's suffrage were actually racist. Despite the shared goal of suffrage, white suffragists often excluded Black women from their organizations and events. This segregation was evident in the National American Women's Suffrage Association, where Black women were frequently marginalized or ignored. The 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., organized by Alice Paul, exemplifies this exclusion. Black women were asked to march at the back of the parade to avoid offending Southern white suffragists. Ida B. Wells Barnett faced significant resistance from white suffragists and often had to fight for inclusion. When Washington, D.C.'s first suffrage parade was organized, Alice Paul expressed concern that white women wouldn't show up if they knew they had to march alongside Black women. She felt that there should be a white procession or a Negro procession, or no procession at all. Black suffragists, including Barnett, were asked to march at the back of the parade to avoid offending Southern white suffragists. Ida B. Wells Barnett was told that the historic march was segregated and that she would have to walk with an all-black group. She ignored that instruction and ended up walking with the Illinois delegation. A smattering of other black women showed up to the march despite Paul's warning. Many white suffragists adopted a strategic approach that pandered to racist attitudes to gain broader support. Leaders like Stanton and Anthony sometimes argued that educated white women deserved the vote more than uneducated black men, appealing to the prevailing racist sentiments to advance their cause. This approach not only marginalized black women, but also reinforced racial hierarchies. The suffrage movement largely focused on gender discrimination, neglecting the intersectional struggles faced by black women. Issues such as racial violence, economic exploitation, and social disenfranchisement were sidelined. Black women were left to address these issues within their own communities, often forming separate organizations such as the National Association of Colored Women, led by figures like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells Barnett. After the passage of the 15th Amendment, black men began attempting to exercise their legally protected right to vote, but were met by lynch mobs. Between 1877 and 1950, about 4,000 black people, primarily black men, were lynched for perceived infractions, including attempting to register to vote. Ida B. Wells Barnett was a prominent journalist and championed anti-lynching, a cause she considered integral to the fight for voting rights. To help obtain voting rights for black women, Wells Barnett founded the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, formed in 1896 by Mary Church Terrell, merged a number of black women's social clubs together, also included suffrage within its platform. Terrell worked tirelessly to address the dual oppressions of race and gender. She highlighted the need for the suffrage movement to embrace black women's rights, but her calls were often ignored by mainstream suffragists. Meanwhile, some white leaders of the suffrage movement worked alongside white supremacists and chose to appeal to white supremacy to increase their support. They argued that enfranchising white women would help maintain white dominance. This tactic further marginalized black women and perpetuated racial divisions within the movement. The movement's leaders often argued that they needed to focus on gaining the vote for white women first, believing that addressing racial issues simultaneously would dilute their efforts. This prioritization left black women to fight for their rights on two fronts, both within and outside the suffrage movement. Many white suffragists didn't advocate for the ending of lynching because protecting white women's virtue was often the excuse used to justify the brutal act. In the white imagination, black men's insatiable sexuality was a threat to white women's purity. After the passage of the 15th Amendment, Rebecca Ann Latimer Felton, the first woman to serve in the Senate, pushed this dangerous message. I do not want to see a Negro man walk to the polls and vote on who should handle my tax money, while I myself cannot vote at all. If it needs lynching to protect women's dearest possession from the ravening human beast, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 granted women the right to vote, but many black women in the South remained disenfranchised due to Jim Crow laws and racial violence. It would take another 45 years for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to pass, securing black women's right to vote. However, state laws and state violence still worked against them. The exclusion and exploitation of black women in the suffrage movement had lasting consequences. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 addressed many barriers, but in that time, black people, men and women alike, were met with violence when they attempted to exercise their right to vote. The black vote was resisted by white supremacists who beat those who protested or attempted to exercise their voting right. The marginalization of black women in the suffrage movement also underscored the necessity of an intersectional approach to social justice. The struggles faced by black suffragists laid the groundwork for later civil rights and feminist movements, highlighting the interconnected nature of race and gender discrimination. The contributions and struggles of Black suffragists remain an essential part of history. From the 1800s until now, Black women have been at the forefront of a movement to make voting easier, more equitable, and not rooted in racism. With or without recognition, Black women have always been present and fighting. Until next time, if you like little-known history facts as I do, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Press the bell to be notified of future uploads. Thank you for watching.